Okay, I'll be honest. Encanto is probably my favorite Disney movie of all time. I've never wanted to watch a film over and over quite so much, yet here I am making a video on it, still not sick of the soundtrack. As per usual, I won't be able to play clips with sound, but will instead rely on stills and brief clips and GIFs without for most of my points. It's gonna get a little bit personal, as reflecting on both the pagan and the political themes in this movie requires talking a bit about why I had such a strong reaction to it in the first place. That said, I'm not the only one. My buddy Rotworked on Twitter, the head of the Newman Arts Collective, had a lot to say too, and our conversations opened my eyes to the layers I could sense but not fully explain in my own reactions to what I saw on screen. With that in mind, lights, camera, action. I'll be honest, when I first saw this movie, I was more than a little primed to react strongly to its themes. As we'll get into later, some major revelations came out a few weeks before I saw the film about the horrendous atrocities committed against Indigenous Americans, some of which mirrored stories I'd heard in my family growing up but didn't fully understand because of how young I was. We'll get into that in a bit, but I would like to give you all a quick trigger warning. We're going to be talking about historical violence, colonialism, and abuse, including non-consent during segments on the history of Colombia as it pertains to the movie, and my own reflections regarding my family and investigations in Canada, which, trust me, all relates to my reactions to the film. If those are too heavy for you, then you might want to sit this one out. If you can stomach it though, this is history that needs to be heard. Also, of course, spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the movie. The big revelation at the end regarding the colloquial "the violence" is necessary to everything we'll be talking about, so go watch the movie first if spoilers bother you. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt my best to relay some of the historical factors that led to the themes in the movie, both modern and in the colonial history of the country where Encanto takes place. Part 1. The History of Colombia. So, quick disclaimer, I apologize in advance if I get anything wrong or accidentally perpetuate a narrative disagreed on generally in Colombia itself. I'm doing my best to do research including own voices, as I always do when I talk about history not my own, but what I can access in English and translated is limited. I'll do my best to cite interviews, sources, and discussions from Colombia, as well as academic sources that I can get access to online. Even with a JPass subscription, a lot of articles on Colombian history and modern conflicts were locked behind really steep paywalls. I also sent the section on history to a member of my community who was from Colombia to look over before recording, so if I got anything wrong that they noticed, they could let me know. Even with all those precautions though, colonialism is insidious and can slip through the cracks, so let me know down in the comments if I get anything wrong. With that out of the way, one of the first interesting things I found while doing research on Colombia's history was that though the country was named after noted slaver and all-around candidate for a long stay in Tartaros Christopher Columbus, he never actually set foot there. Seems to be a theme with things named after him, but that's a discussion for another day. Instead, one of his dickhead buddies, a slaver named Alonso de Ojeda, takes the title for having started Spanish colonization of the indigenous peoples there. Before we talk about him, let's talk a bit about the people he screwed over, because they're often neglected in discussions of history or branded as brutal savages who were better off because of colonization. That's bullshit, by the way. We all know that, right? Right? Colombia was home to numerous cultures and civilizations prior to Spanish colonial invasion. The Tolima, also known as the Panche people, were wiped out by the Spanish when they refused to submit to colonial rule. A lot of what we have on them comes from accounts by the Spaniards, and if you've ever read anything by colonial power written about indigenous people that they're in the process of killing en masse, you'll know just how biased they can be. Most of what we have written on them specifically comes from the Spanish quote-unquote historian Francisco López de Gomara, who I'll note had never actually been to the Americas, but did interview Hernando Cortés and other colonial dickheads from his expedition when they returned. His works were heavily criticized even in his own day for being way too charitable with the Spanish and their actions and presenting a not particularly accurate account of the atrocities committed against the peoples he documented. Still, they're most of what we have other than artifacts, so it's what we have to go on. According to these accounts, the Panches wore scant clothing, often half-naked, and were known for shaping and elongating their skulls using two boards from childhood. They were frequently adorned with gold ornaments, feathers, and earrings, which is a big part of what drew the attention of the Spanish. The Spanish claimed that they were cannibals, by the the way, but archaeologists haven't found any evidence on this of remains from their enemies or their own people. European colonial powers love to accuse indigenous cultures of cannibalism. It was very rarely true. They kicked the asses of the Spanish the first time they attempted to take their lands, particularly due to their use of spider and snake venom on their weaponry, and it took an alliance with the next culture that we'll talk about, the Muisca, to wipe them out. Because of this, we've lost nearly everything aside from their artifacts and the accounts of their genocidal conquerors. The Muisca are the people from whom the Spanish learned and then twisted the stories around the famous El Dorado. Their civilization was just as quote-unquote advanced, as much as I hate that term, as the much more famous Inca, Coloa Mexica, and Maya, though not nearly as well known. That middle name might sound a bit strange to you because you likely heard them referred to as the Aztec growing up. The Muisca are best known today for their incredible gold artwork, which, much like the previously mentioned Tolima, caught the attention of the Spanish for its intricacy and the sheer amount of, well, gold that they used, primarily for art and decor and not currency, as was the custom in Europe at the time. They were organized in a confederation of states, each of which retained some level of sovereignty, so there wasn't a central ruler like an emperor or king. Instead, each tribe was ruled by a chief, and in the northernmost militaries answered to the Zipa, or ruler, based in Muquita. The southernmost answered to the Hoa in Hunza, which today is known as Tunja. The famous El Dorado myth actually originated from a ceremony performed by the Zipa, where they covered their future chiefs with gold dust and floated them out to the center of the Siecha lakes on a gold raft. He offered gold and emerald votive offerings to the gods, jumped into the lake, and came back up the new leader. Archaeologists think that the fascination with gold had a lot to do with the central place that the sun had in the Muisca religion. The main deities of the religion that we still know of today are Swea, the sun god and father of the Muisca, Chia, moon goddess and the mother of the Zipa, and Batwe, the water goddess and mother of the people. There are actually 3 remaining indigenous councils of the Muisca surviving to this day, found in Cota, Chia, and Sesquile. They published a magazine called Swati Magazine, which I sadly couldn't find any copies of. It's important to not talk about these cultures as though they're completely in the past, as modern survivors struggle to protect the sacred sites and recover what they can of their cultural heritage. Indigenous peoples are treated horrendously in most South and Central American countries, let alone North America and Canada, and little if any attention is actually drawn to this on a worldwide stage. There's far more focus on the modern drug lords and the issues that they create, which we'll talk about later. There were a number of other indigenous groups, including the Inca, who were present in the area as foreign occupiers, and of which you can find plentiful information in libraries and such, so I won't go too deep here. But the other two, the Tolima and the Muisca, were the groups that I was able to find the most on that I don't also often see discussed very much in the United States. With that, let's talk about the brutality of the Spanish and Colombia's rather violent history. After Spanish colonizers brutally murdered both of the main leaders of the Muisca in the 1500s and built new cities atop the ashes of those they'd burned down, they managed to hold their horrendous colonial rule for over 200 years. In 1811, Antonio Nariño led a revolution that led to the independence of Cartagena, which resulted in 2 separate governments, and eventually a civil war. By 1812, the United Provinces of New Granada had been recaptured by the Spanish, who punished the rebel leaders. This sparked even more rebellion, primarily led by one Simón Bolívar, dubbed the Liberator, leading to a formal declaration and achievement of independence by 1819, though some sources say the Spanish continued trying to recapture it until 1822. Bolívar was also elected as the first president of the newly formed Republic of Colombia, which at the time was made up of Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. The other 2 left the Republic in 1829 and 1830, respectively, leaving Colombia by itself. After a civil war from 1899 to 1902, which led to Panama's independence, recognized by Colombia following the payment of $25 million in reparations by the US in 1923. Well, why reparations? The US funded a coup in order to build the Panama Canal there. The government stabilized until struggles between Colombia's main 2 parties escalated to the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, the liberal presidential candidate at the time. Cue mass national riots and the deaths of almost 200,000 people. According to an interview with Colombian author Juan Gabriel Vasquez, this assassination is very similar in Colombian collective consciousness to that of the Kennedy assassination. A lot of conspiracy theories surround it, and some Colombians have dedicated their lives to try to uncover why the lone gunman, lynched from an angry mob mere minutes after committing the act, did what he did. Another civil war from 1954 to 1964 destabilized the government, collectively known as La Violencia, or the violence, until a truce was reached in 1964, which lasted for 16 years. After 1970, violent drug cartels seized power all over the country, similarly to the way that the American mafia ran New York during the height of the Depression. Ever heard of Pablo Escobar? Do some Googling if you don't know about his reign of terror and the mass funding of violence and disruption his fortune brought to the country. Colombia is plagued by violence and upheaval brought by these cartels to this day, though hope has been reported on the horizon by various news outlets with the acceptance of Colombia to the UN Security Council in 2012. All of this struggle has created a diverse, seemingly racially tolerant culture, though not without its own ongoing struggles and abuses. I've linked a fascinating paper written by a Colombian national who studied indigenous people in their hometown as an anthropologist to document the evolution of the burgeoning indigenous identity movements there. It's a long but fascinating read and was an invaluable resource for this section of the video. In 1819, following Colombia's independence, indigenous peoples who inhabited Colombian rainforests were classified as savages and refused integration into society. They were legally handled as children, especially those with darker skin. Northern people near urban areas were classified as mestizo, or mixed ancestry, regardless of skin color, lineage, or culture, to help force a cultural assimilation of the population. This also gave the government the opening to reclassify resguardos, or land that was reserved by the Spanish colonizers as indigenous communal land, as the potential agricultural or urban sites for the new government. Most of this land was either sold off to new independent owners or kept by the state, and the people who lived on it were evicted and reclassified as mestizos, which kept them from being able to file their evictions in a suit as ethnic discrimination. According to the author, this resulted in the majority of indigenous people becoming lower-class cheap labor for those who already had wealth prior to independence, erasing their identities and struggles in favor of a class model that ignored their needs as individual cultures and peoples. This was framed as liberation, despite being in effect cultural genocide. Racism against them didn't go anywhere either, just the legal recognition that it happened. Must sound familiar to anybody who's familiar with North America and Canada and the attempts to delegitimize indigenous struggles there. Interesting note, according to the Colombian community member that I asked to help review the history portion of the script, there was a section of the country that refused to participate with Bolivar during the revolution called the Pastusos. Apparently they were so hated due to this, the word for their culture and geographic area became synonymous with the term idiots. When we looked it up together, we discovered that these people were direct descendants of indigenous peoples in Colombia and were likely the beneficiaries of the resguardos that didn't want to actually lose their rights to their land. The stereotype is so ingrained in Colombian culture that most residents there apparently have lost sight of the origins of the term. Indigenous rights activists in the 1970s and 1980s fought for legal recognition in Colombia despite fierce government reprisals. Leaders were frequently jailed, disappeared, or outright assassinated by the government in power at the time. Despite overwhelming odds, they persisted and managed to achieve constitutional reform in the 1990s, allowing various indigenous groups to petition for official recognition. This brought on its own challenges, as cultural difference, the possession of surnames that were associated with indigenous cultures, spirituality differences, and locations lived were all qualifications regarded for a single person to gain acceptance as an indigenous person regardless of their ancestry. This has led to pressure, both from within and without, on indigenous peoples in Colombia to adopt both carried-on traditions and new recovered spiritual traditions and abandon their previously genuinely held religious beliefs in order to have their indigenous identities be accepted, because the criteria of cultural difference must be upheld for the groups to continue recognition by the state. I won't get too deep into how that can affect a person here, but needless to say, a crisis of authenticity on an individual level is bound to result when an external force defines you by difference after hundreds of years of forced cultural assimilation. In addition to the drug violence, there have been several other violent conflicts brought on by modern paramilitary and guerrilla groups attempting to overthrow the current government following the aforementioned La Violencia. Over 8.1 million people have been displaced from their homes since 1985. These groups primarily target those who live in the countryside using tactics such as blackmail, extortion, and threats of violence, often following up with actual assassination, torture, and enslavement for those who don't comply. Because they specifically focus on rural areas the government struggles to protect, a disproportionate number of those displaced are indigenous. One group, known as FARC, has assassinated U.S. indigenous rights activists helping the UWA people in the 90s with establishing UWA schools. This group is known to assassinate indigenous leaders when they try to prevent them from recruiting kids forcefully in their villages. According to statistics, statistics that I was able to find online, approximately 10% of the recognized indigenous population of Colombia has been displaced from their homes since 1984. I stress recognized here because, as I mentioned a moment ago, ancestry is not the only qualification in Colombia to be recognized as indigenous, so many indigenous people with indigenous ancestry have likely been displaced but were not accounted for because the government does not recognize their claim to indigeneity due to the aforementioned cultural difference, surname, location, and other requirements for legal recognition. In 2016, the Colombian government signed a peace treaty with FARC that required the FARC war criminals to surrender their weapons in exchange for immunity to prosecution from the government. According to the organization Human Rights Watch, the majority did, and the leaders formed a political party, but a number did not, and instead formed separate paramilitary groups that still terrorize the countryside to this day, in part because of inadequate reintegration programs put out by the government. Regardless, modern indigenous communities in Colombia remain under siege by both the remaining FARC dissidents, the new paramilitary groups formed following the treaty, and another group, known as the ELN, whose negotiations with the government between 2017 and 2019 ended with ELN members bombing the car of a government official. According to more recent sources that I found online from indigenous activist groups internationally, almost 1,000 indigenous people have been killed since the treaty was signed in 2016 while defending their sovereign territories from these groups. In other words, it was quite likely that the violence experienced by Abuela in the movie was actually racially motivated. Let's talk a bit about what all this violence does to a family long term. Part 2. Racial Trauma. I could have just named this section Trauma, due to the violent nature of the traumas perpetuated on Abuela in Encanto, but for me specifically, what resonated the most was the racialized aspect of the trauma itself. Being driven from your home and forced to adopt a new life, and the way that that pain can trickle down through children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren hit me like a ton of bricks. Because my family has an equivalent to Abuela. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail regarding my family history here, but one of my ancestors had to flee Canada in order to protect my family from what being indigenous meant in both Canada and the US in the 18 and 1900s. I heard stories growing up of the horrific treatment of people who got put into the concentration camps, detention camps, residential schools. And many of those stories were recently validated in the Kamloops investigation that has been ongoing in Canada. Given how half of my family denied our heritage right up until my grandma died, it was a huge shock to have a lot of the things that were seemingly ambiguous confirmed as true. The language I learned bits of, the stories I heard, none of it was manufactured by crazy relatives, it was all true. Needless to say, it left me with a lot to process, but this was the fertile ground that Encanto found itself rooting in my own mind when I saw it for the first time. The fear Abuela had, forcing all of her children and grandchildren into perfect roles to protect a model society so she'd never be again the victim of the violence, as the showrunners called the terrifying flashback that we see at the end of the movie, echoes the fear and shame of our indigenous heritage in our own family. My grandma told tales about how it was worse to be Indian than Black in northern Washington when she was growing up, and I can only imagine the amount of courage it took for my great aunts to keep our history alive. For her to tell those stories on her deathbed as well, so our history wouldn't be lost with her. That shame, that fear, transferred to a very similar protective familial roles to those found in Encanto, all wrapped in a veneer of what was allowed to be said, what is acceptable, so that the trauma of the family could never be repeated. I can't get too deep into specifics, as I don't want to expose my family's dirty laundry in public, but the idea of a large institutional trauma leaving a massive mark on a community that moves through generations is deeply resonant with me. The other thing, though, on a much more positive note, is that the celebration afterwards is as well. The beautiful traditions that the family built to protect the community they became a part of, to integrate and to work together. When the whole town came together to rebuild their home, I thought about how my whole family came together to help one of my cousins in rehab and get them back on their feet after the terrible consequences from their addiction came to bear. I thought about my uncle expending his hunting license and working with my aunt to can and preserve elk sausages and salmon to send them out to anyone in the family that wanted or needed the meat. I thought about clam digging and fishing as a kid, then dividing up what we got after a portion was put into the pot for that night's dinner. And I thought the most about all the ways the bits of our culture were passed down without the full understanding of where all of those ideas came from. The communal spirit that comes from our indigenous heritage, and that symbolism that a lot of us intuitively understood from a young age to be a part of that. This brings me to my buddy Rotworked from Twitter, who brought up some awesome observations about ancestor work and the nature of a lot of the symbolism in Encanto. The conversations we had leading up to this recording were incredible. I'll let him tell his own story here in his own words.
Hey, Linan here. Thanks for inviting me to speak a little on the subject of Aliakai, and thanks for doing a video on this movie. While I'm not Colombian, I am a Mexican American, or Mexican Canadian now, who would technically count, as per the racist and colorist caste system implemented by the Spanish in the 18th century, as a castizo, someone with about a quarter Indigenous ancestry and 3/4 European ancestry. And I'm here to talk a little bit about why the story of the family Madrigal hit me really hard. In fact, I've started referring to Encanto as the Latino ancestor work movie. As Aliakai recapped previously, Colombia is no stranger to upheaval and violence, and though that's been broadly true throughout Central and South America, Colombia in particular has suffered repeatedly and recently. Encanto does an excellent job of referencing the specter of this violence in an age-appropriate way, but it also universalizes the experience, bridging many various episodes of armed conflict throughout the region and uniting them in the climactic moment of horror at the end of the film. This universalizing method is present throughout without sacrificing elements specific to the Colombian setting. For instance, it's difficult to pin down what era the story takes place in. The multi-generational household reflects a number of different decades simultaneously, and the design of casita is not specific to any one place. Though one of my favorite reads is that the Encanto itself, the oasis of peace and prosperity that erupted from the miracle, is a diasporic space. It is self-actualized. The concept of diaspora in itself is a difficult animal to evaluate in the context of Latin America because it doesn't fit what we're used to seeing with traditional diasporas of Europe, Asia, Africa, even when it's a result of violence. But the pain and the disconnect are present traumas, and this is exactly what we see in Encanto. I know that in my own family history, perfectionism was required to survive and to succeed in the new home. It was the difference between being treated or ignored by medical professionals, graduating or dropping out of school, or appealing to a new employer at a job interview who was already judging you because of the family name you listed. Because when most everything of your culture is stripped away, and all that's left is the color of your skin, or the shape of your face, or the smell of your home kitchen, how do you close that last gap and fit in a white society? You adopt the optics and praxis of model citizenry. Weakness, emotion, and fallibility aren't moral failings, as is more the case in a Protestant culture, but they're very real material liabilities. Fortunately, the Madrigals didn't have to worry about holding themselves to the standards of outsiders. The Encanto is a bucolic paradise for everyone who lives there, no matter the color of their skin, and there are so many skin colors represented. But the dynamics still play themselves out because of the trauma passed down socially and genetically through the character of Abuela. Speaking of Abuela, let's not mince words here. She is absolutely venerating her beloved dead on screen. And we can pretty much guarantee this because of the symbol of the butterfly, or moth, present on the candle, which in much of Central America, and in some parts of South America, represents the spirits of the ancestors here on Earth. This is a recurring motif throughout the film too. There's so much that viewers can unpack with this movie, and the galloping pace of the story leaves things to be discovered on a rewatch. I originally saw it while visiting my mom for Christmas, along with my grandmother. If any of you are familiar with my Ancestor Project blog series, you might understand the power that this moment had for me, as these two living women are the foundation of all the ancestor work I've done so far. In fact, I cried a good half dozen times throughout, but notice my grandmother was eerily quiet. Secretly, I was hoping that Abuela would remind her of her own mother, someone who demanded perfection from her 9 brown children, a few of whom turned out to be Brunos themselves. But I'm not sure. The famed Mexican stoicism won out instead, covering, as it does, the trauma born of 500 years of colonial parents making painful demands of their colonial children. So that's it for my spot. You could find me on WordPress as Rotworked, ROTWORK, or on Twitter as Rotworked. Also check out my Newman Arts Polytheist Art Collective project at newmanarts.org, and be sure to support your local pious artists. Thanks, Aliakai.
Thank you so much, Landon, for helping me out here. There's a lot more to dive into with the racial themes in the movie, and with familial trauma as well, as is borne out by the conversations we had on Twitter setting up for the collaboration. Part 3. Indigeneity, familial struggle, and recent history. You all might be wondering why I went into all of that detail on recent Colombian history, and specifically the impact on indigenous Colombian people. Quite simply, Abuela's family comes from rural Colombia, where the majority of indigenous people live, and several of them, especially Abuela herself and Isabella, have strong indigenous features. Felix also has Afro-Colombian features, and the majority of Afro-Colombians also live in rural Colombia and are also disproportionately affected by the paramilitary violence that is ongoing to this day. In other words, there is strong evidence in the movie's character design choices themselves that this story has a strong racial trauma component to it. One of the big things I noticed about the patterns in the Madrigal family regarding the kids and their gifts also is that they received them at 5 years old, which then pigeonholed them into a role for the family. Bruno was the prophet who always forecasted the inevitable results of the family's actions. Julieta is the healer who soothes everyone's wounds through her cooking and smooths over the problems in the family. Pepa is the basket case whose moods can swing the weather of an entire room. Isabella is the perfect golden child who has been groomed for the responsibility of taking over the place of Abuela. Luisa is the strong one who everyone dumped their problems and responsibilities on. on. Dolores is the quiet one who knows everything because everyone talks to her. Camilo, being the middle cousin, is the shapeshifter who becomes what the family needs him to be when they need it. And Antonio is a communicator who feels empathy so deeply he can even seemingly communicate with animals. Mirabel not fitting into a role that she could be groomed for, consciously or unconsciously, at a young age gave her the unique ability to see these roles for what they were, even if she didn't initially have the context of Abuela's trauma to draw on to unite the family. Encanto shows the neuroses of generational trauma and how having to survive following such a devastating event can carry through many generations and create all new problems for folks forced to become a role rather than develop as whole people. One of the things I loved at the end of the film was the way that self-actualization for the Madrigal family didn't include losing the collective spirit or collective work ethic and multi-generational living space that they shared, only that they break free of some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms and find a place for themselves beyond the roles they were given from birth. Becoming who they were and finding what they could give willingly instead of only having what they were assigned and groomed for as their forever role was a huge part of self-actualization for all of them, but they all still had that same communal spirit that we saw at the beginning of the movie, and it lasted all the way to the end. The movie naturally rushed the process of healing and placed the responsibility for healing on the black sheep, which itself is an unhealthy dynamic that often happens in families with generational trauma, and I want to stress that a realization like the one between Mirabel and Abuela is usually only the first step. I'm still processing the effects of generational trauma on my family, as is the rest of my family itself. Revelations on my grandma's deathbed about history otherwise lost to us when she died have left many of us reeling, and some folks have chosen to simply dismiss all of it rather than trying to process and heal. This is something that sometimes happens that gets glossed over in stories like this. Still, I've never seen a story deal with generational, racial, or other trauma quite the way that Encanto does, and I've felt seen from the moment that I finished the movie. I hope the exploration of Colombian, Indigenous North American, and Mexican history helps elucidate a bit about why both of us felt such a strong reaction despite neither of us being Colombian ourselves. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, exile the subscribe button and harangue the like until it finds its talent. Drop down into the comments and let me know how the movie affected you, if you resonated with the generational trauma depicted so well in the film. Special thanks to Lannon for helping out with both the writing of the script and for your spot as a Mexican-American creator. I really appreciate your perspective and the awesome conversations we had leading up to this project. Y'all, check the description to links to all of his social media and work. He's an awesome artist and has a wonderful blog on which he talks about reconstructing Mesoamerican traditions. Special thanks also to Zipikir from the Zany Bridge Discord for going over the script with me and helping me go deeper into Colombian history than I could on my own. Without you, I wouldn't have known what specific periods to look into detail at, and neither of us would have realized just how much of the more recent Colombian violence has affected Indigenous and Afro-Colombian people specifically. Special thanks also to my patrons. You all have been so encouraging through the doxing threats I've received the past few months, and while I've been dealing with the emotional fallout from the revelations from the Kamloops investigation. It's took a lot of courage to put together this video, and I can't say I'd have it without you all cheering me on. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, stories shape lives.